Hello. Story 1. My dwelling is situated in the northern region of Utah, specifically on the fringes of a modest settlement, positioned adjacent to a primary highway. In that locale, there is scarcely anything beyond a sparse collection of retail establishments, facilities for large transport vehicles, and a solitary lodging house, all conveniently located directly alongside the principal thoroughfare. The roadways extending towards the peripheral areas of the community are exclusively composed of unpaved earth, merely extending towards a handful of additional residential structures and expansive, privately owned tracts of arboreal land and verdant meadows. This particular day unfolded as quite typical for me. I conduct my professional duties remotely from my residence and concluded my work around the hour of 6:00 p.m. Following that, I made my way into the town center to procure some essential groceries and replenish various household provisions. Even though it was a community nestled by a highway, the thoroughfare itself was not particularly bustling. Consequently, none of the retail outlets were ever excessively populated. I maneuvered my vehicle into the parking area and commenced my shopping. While I was within the establishment, however, I happened to discern an individual observing me. Initially, I attached no significance to it. It was probable that I simply glanced in his direction at an inopportune moment, just as he coincidentally cast his gaze upon me. I continued diligently with my purchasing activities, but a couple of minutes subsequent to that, and within a distinct corridor, I once again caught sight of him from the periphery of my vision. He advanced into the very same unpopulated aisle I was occupying and positioned himself merely 5 or 6 feet to my side. I maintained my forward gaze and endeavored to locate the items I required. Nevertheless, I observed that he was not actively moving about or selecting any merchandise. Therefore, I subtly shifted my eyes slightly so that I could perceive him more distinctly. Although I was not directly facing him, I could discern that he was indeed looking at me. At this juncture, I offered a greeting, then proceeded with my own affairs. The gentleman did not offer any verbal response to me. I promptly retrieved what I needed and exited the aisle. Frankly, I merely considered the individual to be somewhat peculiar, yet I was not deliberating upon it with any significant depth. I proceeded to the checkout counter and settled the payment for all my purchases, then made my way back outside to my automobile. I had parked in the furthest section of the lot, consistent with my usual practice. I deposited all the acquired items into the trunk and entered the vehicle. And as I elevated my gaze towards the remaining expanse of the parking facility, there were perhaps 30 to 40 other vehicles present, but a peculiar sensation lingered. Then I sighted him once more. He was positioned between a pair of vehicles, directing his gaze in my orientation. He did not have any grocery items in his hands, leading me to believe he had not even completed a transaction or obtained any merchandise. What precisely was the matter with this fellow? He was likely some unsettling long-distance driver operating on merely 2 hours of slumber, or something similar. I maneuvered out of the parking area and commenced my journey homeward. The celestial orb had mostly descended by this time, rendering the vacant earthen pathways shrouded in darkness and tranquility. I brought my vehicle to a halt directly in front of my residence and carried in the initial pair of grocery bags. While attending to the storage of those provisions, I became somewhat sidetracked by a telephone communication from my paternal figure. But eventually, I recommitted myself to the task and returned outdoors to my automobile to retrieve the remaining provisions. As I did so, I observed something. I was compelled to narrow my eyes and permit them to adapt to the dimness for a fleeting moment. But far off and somewhat to the side of the dirt road, there was a large truck. Its illumination systems were entirely deactivated. I could only perceive its generalized silhouette, starkly defined against the nocturnal firmament. I possessed just under 40 acres of land. Consequently, the location of that truck was indeed upon my private domain. It had definitively not been present when I drove home. And if it were merely attempting to turn around or had become disoriented, why would it be stationary with no lights activated? I deliberately advanced towards my car and extracted my groceries, maintaining a vigilant watch on the truck throughout the entire process. The most plausible scenario I could conceive was that it might simply be a typical motorist who had veered off the main thoroughfare and concluded that this unutilized land would serve as an opportune location to rest instead of incurring the cost of a lodging establishment. Even though it occupied my property, I had no intention of instigating a commotion if it were avoidable. One can never ascertain who might be present within or what actions they might undertake. I re-entered my residence. After storing the provisions, I drew open the window coverings at the front of the dwelling, simply so I could maintain an observation point outside. As time progressed, approximately over the next 60 minutes or so, I experienced a diminishing sense of trepidation concerning the situation and began to believe with near certainty that it was merely a slumbering driver, still peculiar, but ultimately innocuous. I spent an additional 60 minutes within the living room, engaging in a television program, and never witnessed the truck undergo any movement. The hour was growing late, so I closed the window coverings and ascended the staircase to prepare for rest. I believe I drifted into slumber quite rapidly. However, during the depths of the night, I awakened with a pressing need to utilize the lavatory. I never ascertained the precise hour, but I surmise it was likely between 2 or 3 a.m. I arose, still half asleep, and traversed the flooring of the sleeping chamber and into the connecting passage where the washroom was situated. Immediately upon opening the portal, I detected a faint creaking sound originating from the lower level. I had never before heard such an occurrence. I paused to listen for a second, then closed and reopened the portal to ascertain if the sound would recur. But it did not. I proceeded to the terminal point of the connecting passage and peered down the descent of the staircase. It was entirely dark below, with only a scant illumination of moonlight filtering in from the kitchen windows. Yet there was a presence within that lower hallway. I could discern a faint, almost imperceptible undulation of a shadow upon the lateral surface of the wall. I was unable to determine if it was genuinely within the hallway or perhaps located outside the posterior entrance, and the shadow was merely projected onto the wall. But my cardiac organ immediately commenced to throb with intensified vigor. I silently retreated and re-entered my chamber, closing the portal as deliberately and meticulously as I possibly could, so as to avoid attracting any undue notice. Then I retrieved my cellular device and contacted the authorities. I maintained a subdued vocal tone. For the initial 5 minutes of my vigil, I detected no sound. I began to harbor doubts that they were indeed within my home, until suddenly I detected the creaking sound again. It was a very slow and very subtle perambulation across the flooring beneath me. It seemed as though they had entered the living room. Approximately a minute later, a law enforcement vehicle made its appearance. There was a hurried scurry of footfalls reverberating from the lower level, and eventually departing my residence, just as the officers ascended rapidly. Fortunately, they apprehended him as he hastened back towards the truck that had been parked in the expansive field. Disturbingly, I recognized him as the peculiar individual from the retail establishment earlier. I surmise he truly had been pursuing me, even more disconcerting than his tracking me and unlawfully entering my dwelling. He was equipped with weaponry. The individual asserted he was merely attempting to divest me of my possessions. But from all indications, it appeared far more intimately motivated than a simple robbery. And I remain uncertain as to the duration of his presence within my home. But he never appropriated any items. He did not even possess a carrying apparatus to transport anything with. Furthermore, he was aware of my presence within the residence. He had likely been observing me from some clandestine location outside throughout the entire night. What his true intentions were remains better left unrevealed. Story 2. This narrative pertains to a cross-country excursion undertaken during the preceding summer season. I was following an extended route back to my primary residence after having visited a select group of relatives. Thus, I was operating my vehicle for approximately 4 hours each day towards a distinct locale. This particular segment occurred subsequent to my final interim stop. The entirety of the remaining 8 hours of transit towards my home consisted solely of uninhabited forested areas, to the best of my knowledge. There was an additional urban center I had contemplated visiting, but its geographical distance was simply too considerable for me to rationalize a diversion to that location. From my previous stop, I departed at the hour of 6 p.m., to reach my ultimate private lodging, booked through a short-term rental service, a rustic cabin situated approximately 2 hours away. It coincidentally aligned with my path homeward, which served as the rationale for its selection. I reasoned it would prove superior to any budget-friendly and substandard motel that might be found along the thoroughfare. In my current location, the topographical features were quite level, yet there was a respectable quantity of trees dispersed across the landscape. Upon my arrival at the woodland dwelling, it was evident that they had meticulously planted a precise row of substantial conifer trees in a perfectly aligned formation at the facade of the cabin, with the gravel path for vehicles traversing directly through its central point. Frankly, the exterior aesthetic of the structure, combined with its surrounding natural environment, conveyed a somewhat unsettling atmosphere. I brought my vehicle to a stop and disengaged the security clasp using the numerical sequence I had received via electronic mail from the proprietor. Notwithstanding its outward appearance, the interior of the cabin presented as newly refurbished, likely for the purpose of a short-term rental service, and it was indeed exceedingly pleasant. It was compact, yet remarkably comfortable. I did not engage in extensive unpacking since my stay was designated for only a single night. I seated myself at the dining surface and consumed a meal I had acquired from a drive-through establishment. However, merely 10 minutes after I had established myself, there was a percussive sound upon the entry portal. It caused me considerable alarm because I had not detected the approach of a vehicle or the sound of anyone traversing the exterior. I arose and opened the portal. There stood a gentleman, appearing to be approximately 40 years of age, possessing a beard of mixed gray and black hues and a shaven cranial feature. "Greetings. I was merely making a brief visit to ensure your successful entry and that everything was in order," he articulated with a pleasant facial expression. Recognizing it was now merely the proprietor, I affirmed my satisfactory condition and expressed that all was proceeding excellently. I then extended a good-night wish and gently closed the portal. I found it somewhat peculiar that he presented himself unannounced simply to inquire about my well-being, but I surmised he must reside in close proximity, or perhaps even on an adjacent section of the property, or similar. Furthermore, it is pertinent to mention that the gentleman emanated an unusually potent olfactory sensation. It carried an aroma, perhaps as if he had been engaged in laborious activity within a field throughout the entire day. I simply found it somewhat strange as well. I returned to the dining surface and completed my meal, then took a shower to unwind for the forthcoming night. I was submerged for perhaps only 5 minutes before feeling sufficiently fatigued and simply desiring to recline upon the bed. I dried myself and settled into the bed, engaging with my cellular device for a brief period, when there was another percussive sound upon the main entry portal. This particular instance startled me just as profoundly as the initial occasion, because, once again, I had not detected the arrival of a vehicle or the sound of anyone traversing the exterior. It had to be the proprietor again, but for what reason? And so soon after his previous appearance. Immediately, I recognized this as anomalous and felt profoundly uneasy. I checked my cellular device, and naturally, there was no textual communication or vocal call from him. I slowly advanced into the principal room, hearing him knock several additional times. I was uncertain whether I wished to open the portal or not, but I ultimately chose to simply call out from the opposite side and inquire as to his requirement. He ceased his knocking. "Could you open the door, if you please? I merely wish to inquire one more thing of you. I shall be expeditious. I guarantee it." I did not provide a response for a few seconds because I honestly had no idea what utterance to make. In those fleeting seconds, he must have grown impatient because he struck the portal again and reiterated his request for me to open it. I stated that it was late and I was not in the appropriate disposition. Therefore, if there was no genuine emergency, then I desired to be left undisturbed. He took a protracted period to respond subsequent to that. The silence that permeated the air was truly disquieting. Once it extended to a full 60 seconds, it became even more so. I did not detect any sound of his departure. So, was he merely standing outside? I quietly advanced and peered through the diminutive glass pane on the portal. He was not present outside. I immediately concluded that he must have stealthily withdrawn, because I surely would have detected his footfalls upon the gravel if he had simply walked away. But then, where was he? I remained in a state of uncertainty as to what course of action to undertake. I experienced a profound sense of discomfort and could not comprehend the reason for his anomalous behavior. I remained stationary by the portal for a full minute and listened for any indication of presence. Honestly, I was apprehensive to move, but then I happened to cast my gaze towards one of the glass panes in the living area. I perceived his ocular organs fixed upon mine. I succumbed to panic and sprinted towards the sleeping chamber, where I initiated a call to emergency services. While I awaited their arrival, I detected what sounded like him attempting to elevate the glass pane, which was terrifying, yet also peculiar considering he must have possessed a key to his own dwelling. But at that precise moment, I comprehended the entire situation. That individual was not the true proprietor. This revelation was subsequently affirmed upon the arrival of law enforcement personnel. He had already fled. We possess no knowledge of his direction of escape, but we successfully established communication with the authentic proprietor and legitimate possessor of the woodland dwelling. I remain unaware of that man's intentions on that particular night. Evidently, he was fabricating information and clearly devising some malevolent scheme. But I am simply relieved that I did not unseal the portal. Story 3. It was the period of spring recess. I was 18 years of age, and in that specific year, my familial unit undertook a journey to a modest, rustic dwelling situated within the state of Minnesota. It consisted solely of myself, my maternal parent, and my younger male sibling, who was merely 7 years old at that juncture. We had made arrangements to reside at this cabin for the entire duration of the week, and a contributing factor for our journey to Minnesota was to explore some of the smaller communities and evaluate potential locations where we might desire to relocate in the future. In any event, the rustic dwelling my maternal parent had reserved was one we had never visited previously, and I do not believe she was cognizant of its considerable distance from the nearest populated areas. She was likely more preoccupied with the financial cost. It was situated quite far north and approximately 35 minutes away from any retail districts. I suppose it served as an effective trial of how capably we would adapt to a more secluded way of life. However, the journey to the destination encompassed slightly over 10 hours. I operated the vehicle for the initial few hours, and my maternal parent undertook the remainder of the drive. We arrived at the rustic dwelling as the sun began its descent. It was truly picturesque, with the orange hues of the sky settling over the dense arboreal expanse and native wildlife. It presented a stark contrast to the towering urban structures and vast corporate edifices to which we were accustomed. The rustic dwelling itself was conspicuously antiquated, however. Every component produced a creaking sound, and the structure did not appear to have been constructed by skilled professionals. It was satisfactory nonetheless. After all, it was merely a cabin. We settled in for the night, experimenting with the wood-burning fireplace and simply recuperating after the protracted journey. I ultimately engaged in a period of slumber for the majority of the evening. My maternal parent retired for the night around 8:30 p.m., but due to my extended nap, I remained awake for a somewhat longer duration. My younger male sibling was also present in his personal chamber, so it was solely my presence within the rustic dwelling. I seated myself by the fireplace, utilizing my cellular device for a brief while, then considered the notion of acquiring some refreshing air and inspecting the rear outdoor extension. It was a notably diminutive wooden platform featuring a somewhat dubious-looking fire pit positioned centrally and a few seating arrangements surrounding it. I took a seat and gazed out into the vast forest. The night was remarkably hushed. No vehicular sounds or bustling thoroughfares, merely the infrequent vocalization of a distant avian creature and the gentle rustling of the arboreal foliage in the air currents. I found it immensely enjoyable. Being situated further towards the north, however, the temperature was a bit more brisk than I had anticipated. I observed some logs systematically piled on the lateral side of the rustic dwelling, and surmised I would attempt to ignite the fire pit. I initiated the combustion without any difficulty, and the flame remained well contained within the central area. So I suppose it was not as questionable as I had initially thought. In any case, I remained seated by it for an extended period. I seldom have the opportunity to engage in this particular type of activity, so I simply absorbed the entire experience. After approximately 30 minutes of being outdoors, there occurred a very sudden and utterly unanticipated auditory event originating from within the confines of the forest. Honestly, I possessed no inkling as to its potential origin, but I did consider that the manner in which it resonated and reverberated through the arboreal growth bore a resemblance to the sound of an axe impacting a tree or wooden material. It was, however, a singular sound, and I did not deem it genuinely feasible for anyone to be present in our vicinity in such an remote area. It was utterly devoid of light outside, so I was unable to perceive anything. But whatever the source, it sounded quite proximate. As I remained stationed outdoors for the subsequent 5 minutes after detecting the sound, I felt my apprehension gradually intensify. Just this unsettling sensation that disrupted the tranquility experienced moments before. I ultimately extinguished the fire pit and returned inside the rustic dwelling. From the faint sounds, my maternal parent and sibling were already in slumber. I was still not entirely fatigued, however. I cannot ascertain if it was still a lingering effect from the extended nap, or perhaps the sound I heard that disturbed my sleep. But I still did not genuinely feel inclined to retire for the night yet. I remained awake within the living room, utilizing my cellular device. I had several cinematic productions downloaded, thus negating any concern regarding wireless internet access. Merely 15 minutes into my viewing, I detected something. I paused the cinematic production and listened intently. I was uncertain if it was the rustic dwelling itself producing creaking sounds from someone awakening or moving about within their chamber, or perhaps merely the air currents impacting the structural surfaces. It instilled that uneasy sensation within me once again. However, I was unaccustomed to inhabiting this particular type of environment. Hence, I believe that was the reason for my heightened susceptibility to disquiet. It was only a minute later that I detected the sound again, however. This time, it emanated from the opposing extremity of the rustic dwelling, not from where the sleeping chambers were situated. It originated from outside the structural barrier, directly adjacent to my position. The sole feature present there was a transparent pane. I leaned slightly closer and listened. Just as I believed I might be discerning something, a forceful sequence of percussive impacts rattled the front entry portal. It caused vibrations across the wooden structural elements. I became paralyzed for a moment, then detected my maternal parent exiting her resting place and hurrying into the connecting passage, inquiring as to the nature of the disturbance. I was standing upright at this juncture, cognizant that something was amiss. But I informed her that someone was at the portal. I could discern that she was quite alarmed as well. She immediately returned to retrieve her cellular device and initiate a call to emergency services, because there was no conceivable justification for anyone to be aggressively striking our rustic dwelling's entry portal in such a remote location. And during the nocturnal hours, as she performed this action, I advanced towards the portal and peered through the small viewing aperture. It was exceedingly dark. There were no illuminating fixtures on the outdoor extension or anything similar, but I could perceive the basic configuration of a male individual standing quite close, simply gazing directly at the portal. And within the pervasive darkness, I could discern the outline of a substantial wooden axe clutched within his hand. I felt my ocular organs dilate and my apprehension intensify dramatically. A multitude of thoughts surged through my consciousness. I endeavored to conceive of any rationale why this was not what it appeared to be. Perhaps he required assistance, or was disoriented, or I do not know. Nothing seemed capable of explaining this situation as anything but malevolent. The individual struck the portal forcefully several more times as my maternal parent communicated with an emergency operator. They never uttered any words, however, offering no pretext for their presence. They merely aggressively hammered upon the portal. In the intensity of the moment, it was challenging to ascertain the precise passage of time. It felt like an eternity, however. But then he performed the action that instilled terror in all of us. A single loud crack reverberated as it slammed into the portal, and the slightest portion of the metallic axe penetrated through the wooden material. At that precise moment, we all hastened into the most distant chamber and secured ourselves within. We detected additional impacts against the portal, but only 4 or 5 before they ceased. We were uncertain if he had already breached the portal or if he had relinquished his efforts, but we simply waited. It required just under 15 minutes for the initial law enforcement officer to arrive at the rustic dwelling, which was honestly more expeditious than anticipated given our remote location. The front entry portal exhibited several substantial lacerations, but there were no indications of the individual having gained entry. There were also no signs indicating the direction the individual had taken. It is merely presumed that he re-entered the expansive forest. The prevailing hypothesis is that the individual was present within the forest when he observed my illuminated campfire from his distant vantage point, thereby drawing him towards the rustic dwelling. This does not, however, elucidate his purpose for being in the forest at night with an axe or the rationale behind his approach to the rustic dwelling. But there is genuinely no means to ascertain those particulars without his apprehension and subsequent interrogation. We, quite naturally, did not prolong our stay there any further. In the event you were contemplating, we also did not ultimately choose to relocate to that area. Bye.